Obituary for Emily Morgan, a journalist and presenter who led ITV's coverage of the COVID pandemic. The 45-year-old broadcaster and news correspondent Emily Morgan oversaw ITV's coverage of the COVID outbreak, frequently risking her personal safety in the process. Her reportage on the coronavirus pandemic, in particular, took her into the living rooms of the country because of how kind and candid she was. She was the channel's health and science editor at the time of her death, covering domestic issues involving the NHS in the UK. Recently, she had expanded her responsibilities to include covering global issues like climate change. In March, for instance, she reported on Pakistani communities still underwater 6 months after devastating floods. She spoke of her duty to report firsthand, which required her to visit ICU units during the daily hundreds of COVID patient deaths. She often remarked that journalists are a window into other people's lives, and while the country was under siege, she was frank in her descriptions of what was happening all over. One ITV viewer said, "When Emily spoke, we listened, following the tragic news of her passing." Emily Morgan, the second of Arden and Kate Morgan's 3 daughters, was born on July 22, 1977, in Banbury, Oxfordshire. The young Emily's early years were spent in a rural setting in the village of Little Compton on the boundary of Warwickshire and Oxfordshire. Her father was an agricultural consultant. After receiving a day education at the local Sibford school, she moved on to Lancaster University to study theatre with culture and communication before completing her postgraduate studies at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston to earn a degree in journalism. For Independent Radio News, the national news service for the UK's commercial radio stations, she started her radio career in 2001 by compiling and reading bulletins. However, her writing prowess and quick comprehension of a complex news topic singled her out for acclaim at ITN. She spent several years working in Westminster as a producer for the political editor of the channel, Tom Bradby. Through her employment, she traveled the world with 3 prime ministers, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron. When politicians visited British troops in Helmand Province, she occasionally found herself in the heart of Afghanistan wearing a bulletproof jacket and helmet. Later, Emily Morgan left the world of acting and joined ITV News as a reporter. She covered Wales and the west of England before going back to Westminster as a political correspondent. When Theresa May ran an uninspiring election campaign in 2017, she was the lead reporter covering it and extensively questioned the then Prime Minister about her unpopular social care policies. But she really found herself as the health editor for ITV. She demonstrated that interviewing those who were providing and getting medical care as well as the politicians making crucial decisions was the most truthful method to report on the COVID problem. She frequently spoke to people who would not survive and those who had narrowly escaped death. After a long day in the acute cancer ward at the Royal Bournemouth Hospital in 2020, several of her interviewees would cry in her presence, and she also shed some private tears of her own. For the first time, cameras were let inside a hospital to document the difficulties patients and employees faced. She stated, "I let the tears roll down my face and onto my lap." She immediately started washing all of her clothes in the washing machine after she arrived home that evening, and the next day, she was back out. She felt it was her obligation as a journalist to leave her own. She was identified as having an advanced form of lung cancer in April of this year. Her most recent report was an in-depth program on how cancer patients on the NHS were forced to pay for private healthcare in order to bypass lengthy waiting lists.